Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Bernard Cornwell, and he's the multi-volume author of novels that are set in the 19th century. The hero is Richard Sharpe, and he has many other books as well as the books about Mr. Sharpe. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leslie.
So 18 volumes in the 19th century military world. Begin to take us back to that place. What kind of a world was it?
Oh, the military world. Actually, it was not that different from today's military world. I mean, I think one of the nice things about writing historical novels is how similar things always are when you go back in the past, yet with very crucial differences. It's a peculiar period. I mean, I came to it through Hornblower, reading Hornblower as a kid. And so I came to it through the Navy and then found these stories of the Army. And people have an idea about the British Army in the Napoleonic Wars, which seems to be... I was listening to Radio 4 in Britain about 6 months ago, and there was a professor of history from London University, my own alma mater, I fear to say, going on about how, you know, the aristocratic officer corps and how stuck up they were. And there were very, very few aristocrats in the officer corps. In fact, less than 3% of the officers were nobly born, and over 5% were up from the ranks. In other words, they were working class yobbos like Sharpe, up from the gutter. He got it absolutely and utterly wrong. And if you read the memoirs, the letters and the diaries, and there are a surprising number of letters and diaries that come from the ranks, or certainly from non-commissioned ranks, from sergeants, but quite a few from riflemen and privates. The immense pride they took in themselves and their officers. I mean, I'm thinking of Rifleman Harris, who says, "We were the best company in the best regiment with the best soldiers, and we had the best officers." And you don't do that by being an aristocratic, class-ridden organization that is going to behave brutally towards your men. You do it actually, but you get a high morale by treating them decently. I didn't really answer your question, did it? But
well, why do you go there? Why do you feel like I mean, I think of a writer, while you're creating the book, you leave the century and you go back there and you relive those experiences.
I'm having a huge amount of fun. I mean, that's it. I'm just having a terrifically good time. And I suppose, I mean, why do you write books? You must write the books you want to read, because other people are inconsiderate enough not to do that for you. Isn't that true?
Oh, it's a wonderful escape from reality for me. My characters' lives are more interesting than my own.
I wouldn't know. I think I take great care to make sure my characters' lives are more interesting than my own, yeah. You do. You write the books you want to read. And when I said when I was a kid, I read Hornblower, and there was no more Hornblower. I came off the end after the 11th book, and I started to read the non-fiction histories, and came across the Army and the stories of Wellington.
Yep. And
I thought, someone's got to write these. These are incredible stories. I mean, they're unbelievable stories. And then I haunted the bookshops, and the books weren't there. And then eventually a dim bulb goes on in my head, and I think, well, why don't you do it? You know, and
so there you are.
It's a gap on the shelf, and it was waiting to be filled. And so
okay.
That's it.
So Richard Sharpe comes into existence. Tell us about his background. He was an orphan, yes?
Yeah, he's an orphan. And again, I suppose, I can't even remember now, because I began writing Richard Sharpe 21 or 22 years ago. I can't even remember what I was thinking at the time, or whether I even planned it out. But it seemed to me important that he came up from the ranks. I mean, it gave him something interesting, which, and it turned out to be actually a very good idea as it has happened.
Well, he'd have certain skills being an orphan as opposed to an aristocrat, right? A whole different set of skills.
Yeah, and if you're up from the East End of London, and basically the skills are survival. I mean, and reading about that army, Wellington's army, which is probably the best army that Britain ever sent abroad at any period of any time, anywhere, it nevertheless, the more I read about it, the more you come to the conclusion that it's basically a bunch of lager louts. I mean, they're hooligans, they're soccer hooligans. Yeah. They're fearful. I mean, as Wellington said when he watches a draft come ashore in Portugal, he says, "I don't know what they do to the enemy, but by God, they terrify me." They were terrifying. And of course, they were given discipline and leadership and weapons, and they became fearful.
It was a cruel world, wasn't it, though, the military world of that time?
It was a cruel world. Things had changed, and of course the extraordinary thing is that 100 years from now, people will look back on this period and say, God, it must have been cruel back then. I can't think what it is that we do cruel, but they'll say it was absolutely inhuman what they did to people in 2001. And we look back and say, God, it was a cruel time. I mean, we're now talking 200 years ago. And for a slight infraction, you could be condemned to 200 lashes, which is almost a death penalty. But at the same time, again, I'm thinking of another soldier, Costello, an ordinary soldier, i.e. not an officer, not even a sergeant, who years after the war said, yes, it was a terrible time, but they were the best years of our lives. And he looked back on it. He'd become a cobbler in London, and he looked back on the Napoleonic Wars as being a time, really the best time of his life, when he experienced enormous comradeship and actually did have fun. Mm-hmm. A strange thing, but he did. And so many letters and diaries say the same thing. So yes, it had the capacity to be extraordinarily cruel. But there were rules, and if you kept to the rules, then it was not a cruel system. Certainly all war is cruel on all soldiers. I mean, you stand more chance of surviving now because the medical facilities are so much better. Actually, the French were much better at it than the British.
You better give us a little bit of historical background to put all these the countries into place here of what's going on for Sharpe's Prey. The English are involved.
Oh, for Sharpe's Prey, it's slightly more complicated, but it's actually terribly simple. I mean, the reason that the series, the Sharpe series, works is the same reason that the Bolito series works, and the Jack Aubrey series works, and the Ramage series works, and the Hornblower series works. It's because us against the French. And it's terribly simple. I mean, it's the old enemy. If you're British, that's it. It's the frogs, right? They're across the channel. They're surplus to requirements. God knows why God made them. Go over there and beat them up. And we've done it every century since time began. I mean, including Mers el-Kabir in last century. I mean, this is the first century in 10 that we've not actually had a war with France, but it's early days.
What did the English want?
Well, get rid of them.
They wanted the territory.
Well, they did indeed.
They
wanted the territory. Indeed, they had the territory. I mean, one of the consequences of the Norman invasion, of course, is that the Duke of Normandy has got immense territory in France. And this expands. So the 100 Years' War, which lasted a good bit longer than 100 years, is naturally an attempt by the English to hold on to their French territories, which was an enormous swathe of France. I mean, virtually everything to the west of France. The whole western part of France belongs to England, or at least belongs to the Duke of Normandy as the monarch of England, and we still have a bit of it. We still have the Channel Islands.
Yes.
I mean, Jersey, Guernsey,
pretty
Sark,
close to the French
Alderney.
shore.
Oh, they're very close. I mean, they're very close. And they are still, they're not part of the United Kingdom. They're not part of Great Britain. They're part of the Duchy of Normandy.
Do people today in Great Britain still think about this geographical territory as somehow rightfully
Oh, no.
the English at all?
No.
It's gone.
But you know, they still think there's something a bit weird going on over there.
What did the French want during this time?
Well, it's rather difficult to talk about the French in this early period, because what do we mean by France? I mean, Burgundy was a separate country. The Languedoc was a quite separate country with a separate language. What the French kings want from Paris, of course, is first to establish a kingdom of their own, which is going to expand and is going to take over Aquitaine and Burgundy and the Languedoc and Picardy and Normandy and Brittany. Brittany was independent for a long time. In the end, of course, France does this and establishes itself, makes itself into a nation. And then you have a competition as to who's to be the top dog. And this is really what's going on in Sharpe's period, of course, is who is going to be the superpower? Is it going to be a Pax Britannica or a Pax Francia in the 19th century? Well, it turns out it's going to be the British. But it is definitely a struggle for world domination. I mean, nothing less. And this is a world war. It began in 1793, it ended in 1815, and it was fought from Java right across to New Orleans and Washington. It was an enormous conflict.
The
and some people... It's really pre-empire. I mean, you know, you've heard the statement that the British Empire was gained in a fit of absent-mindedness. Well, they're being very absent-minded at this time. I mean, India is just coming into the empire, but no one thought of it as an empire. No one has yet given the title emperor. We've lost the United States, the 13 colonies, of course, but it's still Canada. But no one's really thinking empire at this point. They're thinking very much, they're thinking domination of Europe, to make sure the French do not dominate Europe.
Yes.
And this is where we get to Sharpe's Prey, dominating the seaways, dominating the oceans.
And how did the Dutch get caught up in the
The Dutch
middle?
and the Danes. Well, in Sharpe's Prey, it's the Danes. And they're neutral. But they have the second largest battle fleet in Europe. The reason, though it was still a small country, it's larger then than it is now, it had a very large merchant fleet, second largest merchant fleet after Britain. So it has a large navy to protect the merchant fleet. It is nevertheless neutral. By the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 between Russia and France, there is a secret clause in which the Russians say that you, the French, can take the Danish fleet, which was not the Russians to give nor the French to take. But the French want it, obviously to replace the fleet that they lost at Trafalgar 2 years before. And this secret clause is on the desk of Prime Minister Canning, probably before it reached Paris. And so the British know they've got to stop this happening. Yes. And so an expedition is sent to Denmark to take the Danish fleet before the French can get it. It all got very nasty.
Sounds very logical. What's the task before your man, Richard Sharpe here? How's he going to get involved in this story?
Well, this is the essential plot. How do I get him involved in the second campaign of Copenhagen? He goes in there as a bodyguard. I mean, it seemed to me obvious that what happens, it's not a very typical Sharpe book. I mean, in a typical Sharpe book, there's usually a very large battle at the end, which is useful for tying up all the loose ends of the plot. There are no really large battles in the second Copenhagen expedition in 1807, but there is this dreadful, dreadful event, which is the bombardment of the city, and which left about a third of the city destroyed, the university destroyed, the cathedral gone. It seemed obvious to me that Sharpe has to be inside the city because that's where the action is, so he can't be outside. So Sharpe, in fact, is sent along as a bodyguard for somebody. It's all sort of, it's Secret Service stuff.
And he does his job well, but there's a lot of backstabbers in this world, isn't there? There's a lot of scoundrels out there he has to watch out for.
I know, it's called plotting, isn't it? You know, you've got to keep this thing going for more than 100,000 words.
You're the guy that has to create the next problem for him. You don't give him a day off, you don't give him a sort of like a break every once in a while and let him relax?
I have a feeling that, and this is only my feeling, I suppose, that if you write this sort of book, I mean, I write adventure stories, is you keep it moving. Yes. I mean, these are not sort of delicate reflections on the human soul. They're not sort of treatises on the human condition. I mean, these are adventure stories. So I mean, it's rather like the rule in the Battle of Britain. You know, you never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds. So was it Raymond Chandler who said, I mean, he wrote his books in longhand. I mean, we're talking obviously before word processors. And I can't remember now how many words on a page, but he always said that there has to be something memorable on every page. And basically, really with Sharpe, something has to happen to him almost on every page. Yeah. And otherwise,
you can't just move from point A to point B.
No. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth writing about.
Right. While you're writing it, do you live the experience to some degree? Does your pulse ever quicken as you're putting the words on the page?
Yes, it does. And that's something, I mean, I'm not sure it happens as often as it used to. I mean, I've been doing this now for 20-something years, and I mean, day in, day out. So yes, to a certain extent, that reaction has slowed down. But if you do not see it as they see it, if you don't smell it, hear it, see it, it's not going to work on the page. So, I mean, that's part of the fun of it. I mean, people say, isn't it dull? I mean, you know, it's such a lonely life. I think it's not lonely at all. I spend
man
my
sitting
life
at a computer.
Yeah, you know, I spend my life with Napoleon and Wellington and Sharpe and all sorts of interesting people.
Do you secretly wish that you were back there living that life?
Oh God, no. I wrote a trilogy on Arthur. I mean, let's call him King Arthur so people know of whom I speak, although I don't think he was a king. And I got letters after that. I still get them because the books, thank God, still sell. And these are letters I don't get from the readers of Sharpe. And the letters from the Arthur fans or Arthur readers say, "Dear Mr. Cornwall, I have just read your book, The Winter King. I have to tell you, you've got it all wrong. I was Lancelot in a previous life." Right?
Good one.
So,
yeah.
I mean, I'm much too sensible. I'm not going to have any previous life before penicillin.
Yeah.
No, I don't wish I was there at all. I mean, it was as Hobbes said, nasty, brutish, and short.
I bet it was, and it sounds like it from the stories your characters have to tell. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with Bernard Cornwell right after this. We're we're back, and my guest today is Bernard Cornwell. We've been talking about Sharpe's prey, and now a little bit about the man. You were born in 1944. There's a Canadian connection in your heritage.
That's an enormously strong Canadian. I'm half Canadian. Very proud of it, too. I've never met him. Don't know him. I mean, I know his
This
name.
was a Canadian soldier in England.
He was
during the
he
war.
was a flight engineer in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Somebody who was I think, I can't remember, flying officer, I think, whatever rank it was. And he was in bombers. And I know because I did a little bit of, tried to find him, did a little bit of research. I know that he did a full tour, which meant he, went over Germany how many times? 24, 25 times. I mean, extraordinary, brave thing to do. And I'm delighted to report that one of his rewards was to get laid in England. And she was called Cornwall, though you should not read anything into that. I just chose the name because I rather liked it. And she was already married and had children, and her husband, who I guess was British, I never met her either, was abroad, evidently, fighting for king and country, and she reckoned wisely that he could remember how many children they had, and she was not going to get away with saying, "Oh no, dear, no, you always had 4, little Bernard, don't you remember him?" So I was bunged off into an orphanage, and from there I was adopted. But I've always known that I've always known my father's name, rank, and number.
Yes.
Although, as I say, I've never actually met him.
When did you learn about your origins after you were adopted? How old were you?
Well, I think I was about 10 or 11, and at that time you were not supposed to know. What happened was that the original birth certificate, which had your mother and father's name on it, was I'm not sure it was destroyed, but it was certainly taken away, and a new birth certificate was issued called the short form, which had your adopted name on it. But my mother, my adopted mother, adoptee mother, whatever, had been the matron of the orphanage where I was, and she had copied down all the details, and they were in my father. My father kept them in a safe, and one day he left the safe open, which is a foolish thing to do, and I went through the whole lot and got everything out.
Of course you did. You had to do that.
Yeah, and found out who these people were.
Did that surprise you, shock you?
No, I always
lead
knew
you
I
to
was
any
adopted.
conclusions?
I always knew I was adopted. So it didn't particularly. I mean, and when you are adopted, when you know you're adopted, you basically have this sort of fantasy that really, your father was sort of, I don't know, some great hero, and your mother was Marilyn Monroe or something.
Yes.
The dates would have been wrong in this case, but suddenly there they are. There is rather ordinary people, evidently, by the names. But I don't remember it as being anything. I mean, to me, it was just normal. You were adopted, but I did find out the names. Now, of course, you can do it. Anybody can do it. You can, I know in Canada there's a whole government agency, isn't it? You pay them money and they go off and
Sure.
work the introduction.
Yeah, it's much more public. And you grew up in a very fundamentalist family, very, very strict. No toy guns, no toy guns. This
Oh,
is
yeah,
what that
no,
leads
that's
to.
what
Man writes about
what a
all
privation.
kinds
And
of violence and things happening with weapons, and that wasn't connected in any way. I don't.
You're going to lay me down on a couch for the next part of this interview, aren't you? Yes, I mean it's all a reaction to the peculiar people, and the peculiar people was a strange sect. They no longer exist, and
That was the public
that was their
term
name.
for them,
Yes, it came from Deuteronomy. I can't remember the reference now, but the words are, "I will make thee unto me a peculiar people, saith the Lord thy God." Right? It just means a separate people apart.
Yes.
I'm going to make you someone a separate people, and they were. But it was never a very successful sect. It only at its height had 36 chapels. This was probably at the turn of the century, the 19th to 20th century. All of them, except for 2 or 3 in southeast Essex, which is a sort of damp, clay area where I grew up. And the thing that made them different was that they refused to accept any kind of medical attention. They wouldn't go to doctors. They got this from some strange verse in the Old Testament. And then in 1911, a diphtheria outbreak swept through the peculiars.
Wasn't there was an old and a new?
Well, this is what was about to
division of the
happen,
two
yes.
types
And the
of
diphtheria
toy
came
people.
through and it killed a lot of them. And a lot of the children died, and they were taken to court, and they were accused of whatever, and found guilty for letting the children die. And at that point, some of them began to use doctors, and there was a split. And then we had the old peculiars who didn't use doctors, and the new peculiars who did. And then in the 30s, they all got back together again. But even when I was growing up, before a doctor came in, the elders of the church came in and laid hands on us. And but they weren't given. God was only given about 30 seconds to work a miracle. And if he didn't come through in those 30 seconds, then the doctor arrived.
Yeah. Did you eventually rebel against those beliefs?
You had
I
to. You
gather
had
that
to.
different men-
Auden said something rather nice. He said that childhood is a trap, and growing up is learning the nature of the trap. And I think if you grow up in a very harsh religion, and it was harsh. I mean, they disapproved of just about everything. I don't know, cosmetics, wine, tobacco, classical music, because it led to the theatre, which in turn led to God knows what sort of wild life and sin. You had to rebel against it. You had to work out what the hell is going on here. And in some ways, I resent the amount of intellectual effort that had to go into working that out, but I'm glad I did.
And somehow it evolved down this path to lead you to be a novelist, although you didn't really intend to be a novelist, did you?
Oh, I did, I think,
Did you?
yes. Well, yes, I know where you're going, and you're right, but yes, I did. I always wanted to be a novelist, but I never thought I
Deep
would.
down.
Yes, I mean, I think right from the get-go, I thought, I knew it was better than working. But I didn't think it would happen. But, I mean, for instance, my father refused to have a television in the house, and I ended up working for television.
Right.
You know? I mean,
Perfectly logical.
obviously hated alcohol, and I mean, thank God I rebelled against that one, right? And thank God he hated blondes. You know, I ended up working in television. They would not countenance military service. They were all conscientious objectors. Looking back on it, it was a very brave decision to take. But it didn't seem so to me at the time, because I'm an idiot, you know, as a child. And I ended up writing novels about the army.
Became a great novelist. We're going to take a short break and be right back with Bernard Cornwell after this. You've been watching Off the Page today. My guest is Bernard Cornwell. The politics of today that you see, where you're living in the United States and you look around at the world, are they essentially the same or radically different from Sharpe's world of the 19th century?
It's essentially the same, but it all happens much faster. That's the only difference. But I don't think it changes very much at all. And it's still about an exercise of power for selfish reasons. I think what you have to hope is that whatever country is exercising that power, in fact, on the whole, is kindly disposed. And I think that's certainly true of the USA. And I think, in fact, we were probably rather lucky that the 19th century was a British century, not a French century. I mean, on the grounds that if you think that when Napoleon came to power, within 1 week, what had been a nation of 180 daily newspapers was chopped down to 14. You know, this was not a particularly liberal regime. It was a romantic regime. And a lot of people at first thought, my God, Napoleon's a great thing because he's pulling down everything that's old, but they didn't notice what he was also doing. You know, I mean, he was taking away women's rights. He was cutting down on freedom of speech, whole sorts of areas like that. So yeah, I think it was the same. It was much the same.
Do you think anybody living right now needs to get out of this century often through fiction, imagination, whatever?
I think everybody should, via Sharpe, myself. I think everyone should rush to their bookshop right now and buy the whole series, all 18 of them.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Leslie.
Get out of the century while you can. Thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.